Hi, it's Ted Ritzer, host of the Greening Government webinar speaker series. The series is a collaboration between my department, Alberta Environment and Parks, the Alberta Climate Change Office, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre. The goals of the series are to help governments reduce their carbon footprint and to help them grow their green economies. And today we're very fortunate to be joined by sort of an expert in digital transformation, Greg Godbout, who actually had been the Chief Information Officer for the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, but also under the Obama administration was essentially a presidential fellow that helped establish their digital transformation effort, 18F. So, Greg, we're so fortunate to have you present on this topic of how we can actually do digital transformation and to help reduce our carbon footprint in the process.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So as Ted mentioned, around 2013, I joined government as a Presidential Innovation Fellow. That led to a number of me and a number of other people innovators in government, starting and founding a group called 18F, of which I was the first executive director. And then from there, I went to be Chief Technology Officer of EPA. And all the while, this whole process was, I was working on doing digital transformation inside government. And I'm going to take a slice of that in my presentation and really get into the importance of digital transformation, particularly for like the green movement. And in the case, I'm going to drill in on saving paper and the overuse of paper in government. But I will also be telling a little bit of the story of the digital transformation and also what that means for improved services. Citizens in the digital era expect their government services to be digital. So, we have a different expectation and we need to meet that as well. So a little bit about the green elements of it, but I'll also try to put some of those customer service elements in this. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So first I want to drill in a little bit on paper usage. And these statistics probably, people have seen similar statistics before, but in the US, we cut down over 4 billion trees a year, just as part of the paper industry in order to use the paper. And sadly, actually 42% of the wood harvested in the US goes to paper. In fact, 16% of our landfills are filled with paper. So paper is still consumed greatly in the US, so much so that we are actually 30% of the world's consumer of paper. So why does this matter? Why are we consuming so much paper? Where are we consuming this paper? And very often it's in office use. And this one scares me a bit because we take a single document, and in a typical office, it will get copied 10 times, on average 10 times. Obviously, a digital copy is a lot more efficient than a paper copy, but that's not what ends up happening in our office spaces. And unfortunately, 45% of the paper that we use in a given day ends up in the trash or recycling bin by the end of the day. So there is a tremendous amount of short-term usage of paper that has become a significant problem. And one of the areas where we are sort of least innovative when it comes to paper is government. And that gets me to a 2014 story by the Washington Post of a decades-old problem in the U.S. government. And I'm going to tell this story as an example of what I would call a typical legacy database in government. Very often, we think of legacy databases and people will say mainframe or COBOL or some sort of technical main database. But this is an actual slice and a view of another type of database, and this is all filing cabinets and paper storage in a deep cave in Pennsylvania that stores all the records of federal workers, particularly related to their retirement benefits, from the Office of Personnel Management. And they actually used, I think it was like a limestone mine. And it is actually, this is an office for 300 employees of federal government employees that they go into, and their database is paper, and they don't, connect to this through a system and do a search like a Google search. No, they go down the hallways and go into the different storage units and find the piece of paper they were looking for to bring back. And the important thing here is the purpose of this is to process retirement requests. And what happens here is a digital requirement request comes in, meaning someone retires from government and they go online and fill out a document that they're retiring. Now, sadly, they'll often have to print out that document to sign it and then scan it again in order to submit it, but they generally, it becomes a digital submission. At that point, what happens is that digital submission is printed out by the workers, and this is common in government in the US. They will take a digital submission and print it out to actually work and process it manually. And so 100% of the work and processing and analyzing that happens to these requests is actually done in a manual process with a manual file folder, and then people going throughout these filing cabinets to retrieve documents from people's histories. Now, this can take anywhere from very simple ones from 3 days to many, many weeks. And it's a very slow process. And in fact, it's slow enough that government will start paying the retirement benefits as an estimate first until the actual work can be done. And then when they're done processing it, let's say it takes 3 weeks, after they've been processing and making adjudications on what would be the retirement pay for this federal worker, they then go back and enter all that information digitally back into the system. So you have in a process, if you track it from the user, who will often frequently fill out the form online, then print it to sign, then resubmit it, and then that gets printed to be worked on, then resubmitted digitally, you actually have a very inefficient digital process that maybe shouldn't have been digital, or certainly shouldn't have been all paper. So what we have is this absurdity of not making 100% digital processes. So this obviously was a problem for the US government. This was a bit of an embarrassment for anybody who used to lead up the Office of Personnel Management. And so back in 2007, they actually tried to fix this. They released the system in 2007. And what frequently happens, and becomes a common story throughout government, they had a huge, 100 million plus digital failure, a system that they ended up scrapping and throwing away, mainly because they try to recreate an existing process with one big, huge IT project to make a big digital delivery without using modern methodologies and iterative approaches to sort of refresh and look at those workflows differently. And so here you have a digital story too, a common story within government, that very often they do a big IT project with a big reveal instead of using agile methodologies and open methodologies and iterative methodologies to build and evolve it as you go. And at the end of the day, this system is really a case management system. There's files related to individuals. It would be great if those files were digital and got digitized. And to government's credit, they are increasingly digitizing these files as time goes on. But there's also the workflow behind this, where you're managing a workflow process. And that workflow is still very manual today. Now, this also sort of reflects a lot of systems within the US government right now. The digital movement has sprung to life, and it's wonderful, everything that's happening in the US, but we're also in our infancy here. There are many digital processes that what I might refer to as fake digital, that they're digital on the front end, but the back end processes themselves are still manual and paper-based. And we have to address that reality. And unfortunately, very frequently, you will see a celebration by a government agency that we've gone digital, and all it is a website. And on the back end, they're actually printing that out and working on it manually. So we have to get away from this fake digital, that it's a great start. You made a website. That's awesome. We should celebrate it. But you should call it what it is, which is the alpha or the beta, and now that you're moving forward, the whole process should be made digital so that you can then rapidly evolve it and improve your work processes deep behind the scene. That's where you're going to find the real savings in government. It's not building a website and allowing citizens to be able to submit forms faster, only to have them slam on the brakes for a manual process. Where you're going to find the real savings is a true digital process from beginning to end. And a good example of a country that's done this well is Denmark. So I've borrowed some slides from them that they have done about their Danish model and included it here. And this is, I've had a lot of experience. I get to work with a company called Seabrain out of Denmark, and they really introduced me to this digital model. And for someone who is big into wanting government to digitize, I'm very excited about this because Denmark, like Estonia is another country that has done a very good job of digitization. But Denmark's interesting because when Denmark started their digitization, they had the same legacy problems that the US has today and the same legacy problems that Canada has today. So what you have is a country that has made the digital evolution, and there's a lot we can learn from that. Now, they made the digital evolution because they got started a lot earlier than us, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. But generally, what they also have is a high degree of trust from the public sector in this making a digital government. And I believe that trust comes from public goods services, that government provides services at the end of the day. And if those services meet the expectations of the citizens or even exceed the expectations of the citizens, I believe there's a direct correlation into public trust. And I think it's safe to say today as I'm speaking that public trust in the US for US citizens is very low. And so part of digitization, not only to save trees and paper, would also be to build a better government and a more trusted government by citizens. We live in the digital era. We expect services to be digital. It's time for government to meet those needs. And I would hope 100% digital services. So what the Danish have done is today where they stand is 80% of all their transactions with citizens are 100% digital. This has taken them many years. The chart to the right explains their journey, and I'll get into that in a second. What's important about this is 100% digital transactions. From beginning to end, they don't print it out and sign it. They don't make a bunch of paper copies to be stored because legally they have to store paper. They have changed their laws and their systems to the point where if you're a citizen and they have a digital service, you are not allowed to send them paper. It's not legal for you to send them paper. The key to understanding this is a large cooperation between not just the public sector, like federal, state, and local, or national, state, and local, but also with private sector. They started out with a digital signature and a digital ID, and this wasn't successful for them in the beginning. As I speak today, the US is trying to come up with a digital identity. It's currently called login.gov, but there are other agencies that all use their own. And this is something that people in the US have identified as a key strategic early adapters. You need to understand that you can be sure that the person on the other side of that digital signature is the person that you're interacting with. And so in the Danish model, they went after this early on. They didn't have a lot of success with it. It wasn't until the banks adopted it too that then the usage grew. So now you have public-private partnerships of an explosion of adoption, and then it was able to move on. So then it became, well, let's do payments to government back and forth, and that secure emails between authorities, which is that could make sure the person was truly the person emailing you. And they start to build into what they call their sort of digital box, where they actually get their information and communicate between government. What's interesting about this is think of it as like a digital post office box that is identified by you. This becomes a legal form of communication. When the government sends you a notification to your digital box, you are responsible for responding to it. It's as if it was a certified letter delivered to your home. in the US or something to that degree. Now, we have to tackle and identify these identity issues, and digital identity issues, and we have to tackle and take care of the issues around communications and making sure that their legal communications are going back and forth, because you take care of these things, you are starting to build an ecosystem and a platform in which more digital services can be built, not just for government, but private sector can take advantage of it as well. And then they continue to evolve it and pass laws. There are hundreds of laws passed that are around this digitization. They created an Office of Digitization way back, I believe in 2001 or 2. But this was part of this larger effort to go digital and save them tons of money. When you talk to people in Danish government today, they talk about efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. They are also saving trees, trees, and trees. They are not printing anything out. They're storing these things, and they're still got work to do. They're evolving their workflows. They're still making things more efficient. But they've made this journey. They also have had a lot of flaws along the way. They've had their era of big IT, as we would call it in the US and Canada, where these huge projects with a big release date get done, and they ended up failing and being quite the embarrassment. So it's not like it's a perfect story. It's a normal journey of learning lessons, but it's a great way to sort of see into the future. Now, when I bring this up, most people say to me, particularly in the US, they say, oh, but Denmark's small, right? It's the size of Maryland. And that's true. It is small. It's basically the size of a state in the United States. But then that doesn't explain why Maryland isn't fully digital, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with being small. What's wrong is not starting and making this process happen. So there's a great lesson to be learned here from Denmark. And so from here, to give you an idea of what it's like for a service in Denmark compared to, say, a service in the US, with the US still being very paper-based, in Denmark, there's this company, Seabrain, had worked on a project to digitize and automate the divorce process. And so what happened is, as you might imagine, the previous process for divorce in Denmark was heavily paper-based. You submit a form, and then your spouse has to submit a form, and then a caseworker looks at it and determines sort of the level of difficulty of the divorce, how much assets do you have between each other, what children are there. And the caseworker does all the manual work, and they run all over the place, and they confirm these things, and then eventually they come back, and maybe there's a trial date that's needed, or it could be expedited, and because it isn't, and the whole thing gets paper processed, reviewed, stamped, signed multiple times, delivered, stored, and it becomes this legal record. Today, how it happens, actually, I'll tell a little bit of the story how it happened sort of yesterday once they digitized it, and then the adjustments they had to make. But today what happens is that process comes in through the door, the request comes in, and it's digital request, okay? Someone signs in. The request comes in, the person said, I would like to get a divorce. The system, through an API structure, will go and connect to the other systems in government and confirm, one, is this person married? And two, are they married to this person they say they are divorcing? And, does their information match up? And then it will take that information, confirm it, and then, of course, send a notification to the spouse that divorce proceedings have been filed. And then the spouse can file their report, all digitally, all electronically. When they first rolled this out, they did it not in an automated way. They just rolled it out, and they got to a dashboard where the caseworkers could look at the case come in, see the information. All of the stuff they used to verify by manual processes were now verified by APIs, talking to other systems, and pulling that data in. So you can imagine, from a paperwork process, not only were they not making extra copies of paperwork in their digital offices when they were managing these processes, but every other agency they had to talk to, from tax authorities and all these other groups to confirm things, they were all generating paper cases and things on their end, and now all of that was digital for their end. And so a complete digital process comes back in. And then they've noticed that on this control panel that a certain percentage of the cases where children weren't involved and both parties agreed and there wasn't a dispute, well, they just were going to approve this anyway, so they might as well automate it and prove it. And then what happened is divorces started happening the speed of in which someone could get divorced was very quick. In fact, I think the fastest was 5 minutes, but you can imagine what would happen if after an argument you decided to get divorced and you could get divorced that quickly. So what happened is they decided to put a delay in, and they actually have the system actually delays. There's no one working on it, but they have a bureaucratic delay that says, we're going to wait 2 weeks. Right? You've been submitted, everything looks good. We're going to give you 2 weeks now. And it's not a government worker working on it. It's just waiting to process. And that gives the humans, right, 2 weeks to say, that was just an argument. And what's nice about this is, this is a service government provides. Once it was digitized, it was too fast for humans. Right? Like, this is how you've properly digitized. It's too fast for humans. And so now you have to build delays into the system. Instead, what we have, particularly with paper-based processes, is massive delays because people are hole punching and stapling and moving files and getting lost on desks, and the citizen has to file and keep up and figure out where the status is. You don't have that in the digital world, right? These moving things from one desk to another, it's just simply notifications, and that can be tracked, and you can see who has something or not. And now you can start refining your process from an age that was based on paper to a digital age, which basically means you're going to change your processes over time because they're going to become completely new because all the old standards of yesterday don't apply anymore. And so, when you have services like that, I was talking to someone from Denmark. They're actually living in Silicon Valley, and they said, your country, Greg, is very interesting. I got passed by a driverless car the other day, driving on the road, and a driverless car passed him. And he said, I was fascinated, but unfortunately, that same day, he thought, what an amazing country that we can have technologies like driverless cars on the road. And he said, but then I drove into the local DMV to process some licenses work. And he thought, what is wrong with this country? And it's time for us to take these technological advancements. It's time for us to take these methodologies, apply them 100% to not just the front ends of the interaction of government and citizens, but the deep back ends, the work processes, the workflows, and start to get some efficiency gains and start to build world-class services so that we can not only save paper and save the environment and not have to cut down as many trees, but also build trust with U.S. citizens again. And that's when I get to this one process that I just want to sort of talk about in these discussions, and I get back to that 100% digital process. And I call this sort of the absurdity of fake digital, that we are in a journey to digital, and we're not digital until the entire workflow, the deep government processes are also digital. And so I have this little graphic here, and it goes from left to right, and it starts out with what a typical government process is today in our digital infancy. And it starts out with a new web form. And usually this is what was celebrated. I've seen governments actually celebrate a form not being paper, but being a PDF form that you still have to print out and fill out. We have to get beyond that. We have to get much more till we have truly a digital process. But in this case, the citizen comes, they go to a website, they fill out a form, they then have to print it because in most cases with government agencies in the US, they still require a physical signature. So now they have to print it, physically sign it, scan it in again, and submit it to government. Okay, now government receives it in digital format in which they print it out, put it into a file system, a case working file in which they're going to work on it. And then they do the analysis and the assessment all via paper, ultimately taking that final analysis and assessment and turning the relevant work into, or what they think is the relevant work, into some digital format for storage, later. And, this is a lot of excess work to go from digital to paper to paper to digital paper, and so on and so forth. It's fine if this is like a starting place, but very often what you'll find is the budget was set aside to just create this system, and then it sort of dead ends after this. What they're going to find is these systems actually are a little more expensive to maintain, that very often you need extra workers on the back end to deal with the increased workload because the digital form made it easy for someone to fill out. And what you want to see is this whole process is managed with a digital case system and a case file system, and managing it that way. So that's a little bit of the story with paper and digital, and I'll go ahead and stop there. I would say that I will say that even though we are in our infancy and I see people moving forward and I see a lot of systems built like this, I am also beginning to see the realization from people in the digital movement that it's not just about the intersection with the citizen and government, but it's about the holistic process, and that we really need to build agile or digital enterprises as government agencies. And this also means you're going to be continuously improving and adapting your processes, which can get a little scary for government workers who've been working with the same process for maybe 10 years. I think you're going to find that once you have a digital flexible system, that you can keep tweaking and improving that system literally every month and continue that improvement. But you're going to need to make the whole system digital and fully embrace it. So thank you for your time. I hope this was interesting. And Ted, I'll leave it to you.
No, that's fascinating. And, I can't help but sort of ask you the big question here, Greg. If you had ultimate power over government's use of IT, what would your top 5 priorities for governments to kind of, you've described Denmark and of course your experience within the US, but what top 5 priorities would you say that governments should be pursuing?
The first one is a big umbrella one, okay? But it is essentially what's sucking up all the resources, okay? And so I'm just going to call it, just as a term, just legacy modernization, okay? And this is a lot of people aren't like wild about that. People want to build the front end or do some new fancy thing. But if the core engine of your process is a legacy system like OPM's paper system, which is sort of an extreme example, or in many cases, these old COBOL legacy systems that are incredibly expensive to maintain, because to hire a COBOL developer these days, they get paid a ton of money. You're basically keeping them from retiring. And certainly, it becomes incredibly expensive to maintain, and they're not very efficient, and you can't connect into them as easily. And so in government, there's a act that was just passed where they're going to try to do a big investment, and you can go and improve your legacy systems. My concern here with this first request is you should address your legacy systems. They aren't just the big mainframe systems. They are also ends up being thousands, and in the cases of some agencies, tens of thousands of micro applications and little services that are just dispersed everywhere. And you have thousands of little applications, and then you have these major, large mainframe applications, and they suck up all the revenue. The most attention is being spent on the large mainframe ones, which is good and important. But there's very little attention being spent to the small ones. And I don't know this to be sure, but I would say from my experience at EPA and talking with other agencies, just as much money is wasted maintaining those small little workflows with, like hiring a software programmer to manage something like a fleet management or like the vehicles of cars. And there's just these systems that all exist that need to be rationalized down. If you do that, right, you are going to save a ton of money. and be able to take those resources and spend it on mission IT, which is my second point, which is spend less on your IT infrastructure. Okay, move that to the cloud, get to cloud networks, get to cloud servers, to things that are more secure, better controlled, more like evolutionary, and then change your work processes and the way you work on IT and the way you build and approve IT to be more about mission delivery. Okay, so the second thing I would say is move those resources from infrastructure IT department and build your mission IT. And that means a very tight integration between, in fact, I'll stop sharing so we can, because that slide doesn't really talk about what we're talking about, but just that you get towards this integration between your program offices and your CIO's office, but also their IT sources. The future is everything's going to be software, the Internet of Things, all these different things. It will be very hard to define what is technology and isn't, because almost everything is going to be technology. So we shouldn't necessarily think about the future as a department of technology helping in program delivery. Instead, it's program delivery that has technical experts working in it and with other people. And then the third step is, because once I say that statement, people might worry is, oh my gosh, is he talking about having 1 million CIO's offices? No, I'm not. What I'm talking about is technical, is mission delivery in the digital era is going to be technical. And so the next phase, the next item that I would say people should focus on is world-class shared services. I get frequently, one of the problems in government is it's very siloed and territorial. And so people don't want to trust using someone else's system to deliver on something. And they don't want to trust another state maybe who did a similar system that you could borrow upon, or another country. We're going to have to get past that very quickly, because we have tons of reuse of processing and reuse of code and all this stuff that we could be taking advantage of and saving a ton of money if we adopted this. But government has to change itself. In the US, we have an appropriations model that gives money to a specific program and says, build out your program. There is no reward for that program if they also happen to have 2 or 3 services that make 5 other programs save money, right? We're going to have to come up with a system as part of the budgetary process to award that. This is the behavior we want to create. This is the behavior, the habits we want to see happen. So we're going to have to drive more towards that. The other thing I would say is, you asked for 5, right? So, okay. This is a people problem more than it is a technology problem. So what I mean by that is this is an organizational problem. It is time to start looking at the enterprise. And focus on what does it take to be an agile enterprise. And the way I would describe this is one of the core aspects of agile is you have a cross-functional team delivering on a project, right? Makes sense. It works wonderfully. You've got a security person, a developer, you've got end users, you've got domain experts, you have stakeholders, all these people who contribute to successful product delivery. That's how you successfully deliver. That your function or your department doesn't define your value. Delivery defines your value. Your function is why you're at the table. And that same model and methodology should be applied to the CXOs of all these organizations. So in an agile enterprise, your CXOs are your cross-functional team. And they should have sprints just like every other project team beneath them, where they go, of our core processes, acquisitions is holding this up, right? And they should be meeting weekly about agency priorities in delivery of these services and where things are stuck or not. So I'd like to see an agile enterprise, a more an enterprise approach to changing how we do financing, changing how we do budget. And by the way, we can do all these things. People have always told me we can't. I have seen legal examples done throughout many governments, including the US. So I've seen it can be done. It's just a matter of will or won't. And then the next, I would say the last one is, I think, if you do all these things that I talked about, if you do the legacy changes, and then you focused on moving your resources to mission delivery, and then you made cross-functional teams at the levels closest to the citizen, all the way up to the enterprise level, that they're cross-functional, and it's all about delivery of services, and high quality services, and we're sharing those, and also sharing of those services is, I guess, the fourth. For shared service. If you're doing all of that, your organization becomes less siloed and more matrixed in government. I don't know that we'll get to a true flat government model, but certainly matrixed, and more mission centric. And then what's going to happen is your organization will be able to adapt much faster to the increasing changes in the world. And for those, and this is another subject as we enter the world of Industry 4.0, the world is about to change tremendously and exponentially faster than just the information age. And these large institutions, these public institutions, which are there to support a public good, are going to have to adapt faster. And you need all those things in play so you can adapt and either keep or build your citizens' trust. And at the end of the day, if that service doesn't work with the expectations of the era the citizen is living in, the trust in government will be lower. I hope that's helpful.
Well, I would kind of preface another question that I'll pose to you, Greg, and I'll start with this. Like in the old days, like 25 years ago or whenever DARPA first started the whole evolution that turned into the internet, you had this philosophy epitomized by, the TCP/IP protocol, right? Everybody could use it, everybody could share information, and that's kind of what built the internet. And your comment about silos, to me, the current internet is really kind of like about 5 major proprietary silos. You got the Apple silo, you got the Google silo, you got the Amazon silo, the Facebook silo, and maybe the Twitter silo. So one comment that you made that I was really fascinated with was this idea of, I would call the intellectual leverage of looking at digital ID that could be used by both government and banks. So is that, where's the intellectual leverage for breaking down the silos that actually increase trust, like you were mentioning, but also increases efficiency at a new level of efficiency?
Yeah, so is your question, where are we in the U.S. with that, or where are we?
Where should government be going? Because I think you put your finger on something that's really important. Digital ID in a way that could be used between the private sector, the public sector, and in a way that it increases trust, reduces fraud, whether it's money laundering or all of these things, but increases the reliability and decreases the cost. But I think what you started to put your finger on is, like, I think that digital ID could be kind of a pivotal point. What do you think?
It's in many ways, it's a blocker if you don't have it, right? If you don't know with a strong sense of certainty, and it depends on all the different levels of requests, right? You need, if it's a lightweight request, you can have a different level of certainty and so that. But if you don't have a significant level of certainty that you're dealing with the person you're dealing with from a digital, signature standpoint or a digital identity standpoint, very hard to build a process that's all digital, around that, If the way you feel comfortable about that is making someone print something out and sign it and then rescan it and send it into you, it's like, to me, that's like a blanket that you feel safe in, right? You're comfortable with it. Someone can copy my signature. It's like, there's ways around this stuff. But they're comfortable with it because that's the legal way we identified ourselves for decades, And so a lot of this is sort of a risk versus comfort issue, where we perceive things to be risky when really they're just not comfortable. And I think there's also a lot to, if you're in the US right now, I don't know that there's anyone who hasn't had their information hacked either by, a government problem or one of the many private companies who've had this happen. So there is an understandable mistrust of systems now,
yeah.
right? And I think that, the mistrust is legitimate, but we shouldn't let that get in the way of a lack of understanding of how you can do dual authentication in a modern world. And the reason I'm so fascinated about Denmark is they've tackled this problem already, and they use it extensively throughout their whole economy. And there's a lot we have to learn by that, right? A little bit different in the US though, where we have a federated government. Right, we have a staunchly federated government that it's like when an election is over in the U.S., it's not like we have a single government that forms a unity government and everyone moves forward. It's like the game has just begun, right? It's we have groups and mismatches. So within that environment, there's a lot of mistrust at the federal level that there would be this single identity, but yet we all have Social Security IDs. Right? We have Social Security numbers and Social Security cards. So we know there's an element of something has begun that we are tracking humans who have to pay taxes, right? Citizens. You also have at the state level driver's license, right? The states actually have a ton of information and all the digital ID capabilities that they could do that. I think you'll start seeing states really embrace this digital identity because that's right now in their field of play. You take I live in Virginia now. I have a Virginia license, but my Virginia license is accepted as legal ID throughout the rest of the US, right? Won't that be interesting when Virginia says you can have a digital ID that, will other states accept it? Will other systems be able to use it? I don't know, right? These are the things that you're going to start seeing, be tackled. I think that, in a classic U.S. sense, there's, probably no less than 1,000 different groups and organizations everywhere from nonprofits and NGOs all the way to for-profit companies, all tackling this, realizing the big, problem there. But now you have an identity. Now what? How can I communicate? How can the government communicate with Greg legally, right? If you think about this, in a really serious situation, they send the sheriff to your door to deliver, you need to show up to court. Right? Well, how do we do that in a digital environment, right? What if I'm no longer living in the United States? Shouldn't the US be able to legally send me information and understand that it gets to me? And this is where you get to that concept of a digital box, right? As like this digital mailbox, essentially, that is your legal box that you legally are responsible for checking. I think that there will be people that have privacy concerns with this. Right? I think that there will be legitimate ones that have to be addressed. But I think for us to move forward as a society and to save money and make our government work, we need those two things. We need a legal way to communicate with each other, and we need a pretty sure way of identifying who a person is. And then we can build all sorts of systems off of that. And then I think there's a whole subset of levels of other things that are important, but those two are really key.
Well, the last thing that I would pose to get a reaction from you, Greg, is there was somewhere I had read a person had made a comment. Would you trust your health record to Facebook? Which got me thinking about, like, holy cow. To me, it's a little bit like Big Brother is here and now, only it's not the government, it's not the private sector, it's not the not-for-profit sector, it's not universities. It's actually those 5 dominant silos,
right.
from Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Twitter. So, like, how come people aren't concerned about how much personal data they give up? I don't understand it, Greg.
I can only tell you what I've seen in, like, when they've asked people, like, they've done surveys, right? And, like with the government and having like a single ID, and it's just a non-starter for a lot of groups. But it's interesting, if you ask people, they actually think the government already has the information anyways, right? They actually think it exists anyways. There's the expectation is, well, it's already there, right? And, Facebook is a really interesting example, right? Facebook is probably the best system on earth for identifying all the humans, only because even if I desperately don't want to be on Facebook, which I personally don't use, I have an account, but I don't use, but because my cousins and friends all post photos of me in like at events, and then they'll put my face, circle my face. Facebook knows I would exist anyway. So they would have this ghost. Like you could see this, like if I insisted that Facebook got rid of me, there would be this ghost that you could predict that there's a Greg. So, this gets to a privacy issue, right? Like a very serious privacy issue. And I forget the name of it and I should know it, but there's a new law that just passed in Europe for the European Union.
Oh, I know what you mean. It's like GDPR or something like that. Yeah.
Serious teeth, right?
Yeah.
And in sort of classic American sort of US sense, we go, Europe, and companies are starting to take it more serious, but this thing's now enacted and, it's serious enough that it could bring down any US company that just wants to do business in Europe, which nowadays, most companies of any significant size are basically international, whether they know it or not. And they're going to be responsible and held accountable to those international laws. And this thing has teeth. And if someone wants to be forgotten, if somebody wants to say, you remove me, wow. Like, are the credit bureaus in the U.S. going to be allowed to keep my information? I didn't tell them they could have my information, but they know all about my credit, right? We are entering a new age. I hope we take privacy very seriously and pass some laws and enforce, some level of being able to control, an increased level of being able to control your privacy. I worry a little bit though, because I feel like every time there's like a national security director who retires, in the first interview, they say something to the effect of like, no one should assume there's privacy anymore. It's a terrifying thing, And but you brought up the 5 entities. Not to jump onto government acquisitions, but if acquisitions don't start being able to help like people in government be able to buy the services they need at the need of speed, right? Amazon will be an acquisition service for government, right? Microsoft will be an acquisition service for government. In the UK, they have G-Cloud, which started out, I think, as like a cloud service provider. And then it ended up being like anyone who's got a contract with government can get approved on G-Cloud, and it's really easy to buy from, right? In the US, we don't really have an effective G-Cloud being built. The ones I've seen that closely relate to it are Microsoft, Amazon, and I can only, and actually interestingly, Walmart is starting to get there too. So you have Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, and I assume, Google and others are right behind it. But, it's to the point where if a company wants to do business with the government in the future, they have to cut a deal with one of those 5 companies, and now they have a vehicle to do business with government. I'd like to see GSA, compete with that. I'm happy if there's competition, but I'd like to see a government choice too.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Greg. And sort of the last thing that I would turn over to you is, you went from the federal government, U.S. federal government, and now you're in the private sector. I think you should tell us what your day job is now, Greg.
So I work for a company called TechFlow. It's a consulting company. They have a number of different arms. They have a scientific arm. They have a sort of facilities and logistics management arm. And I cut horizontally across the organization, but I also spend most of my time in their digital services group. And our focus is, TechFlow has done a very good job of working with many agile projects in government and helping organizations make that transformation. It's a hard transformation to make, and they've done a very good job being like the Sherpa to bring companies along and executing on agile. I see the next stage as not just being about delivery of technology systems in an agile way, but delivery of an organization in an agile way. And I see TechFlow evolving into that. So I've joined them to sort of help with that.
Excellent. So to be able to track down both you individually and TechFlow, if people Google TechFlow, will that take them to the right website?
Yeah, you probably will find TechFlow. It's headquartered in San Diego, although I'm located in the DC area, Crystal City. The other thing they can do is just, my email address, if you want to reach out directly, is GGODBOUT. It's GGODBOUT at techflow.com.
Excellent. Well, this has been a superb presentation. I'm so happy you agreed to present into our series, Greg.
All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.